In January 2021, two Aboriginal elders walking their own country in the South Australian desert found something that should not have been there. Half buried in red sand, resting beside trees their people had protected for tens of thousands of years, was a live guided missile, not a relic, not a museum piece, but an active weapon, manufactured by one of the largest arms companies on Earth. Sitting inside a zone the Australian Department of Defence itself had listed as off-limits to weapons testing. It took the military 12 months to remove it. To this day, neither Defence nor the manufacturer has ever explained how it got there, or how long it had been waiting in the sand. This is the Woomera Prohibited Area, a restricted zone larger than England. Hidden in plain sight in the middle of the Outback, and long known by a far more unsettling nickname, Australia's Area 51. If you're new here, this is Geography, Science and Mystery, the channel that digs into the strangest, most tightly guarded corners of the natural and man-made world, separating what's true from what only sounds true. If that's your kind of rabbit hole, subscribe now, because this story only gets stranger. Strip away the rumours, and the Woomera Prohibited Area is, first and foremost, a feat of raw scale. It covers roughly 122,000 square kilometres of central South Australia, an area larger than England, and the largest land-based weapons and aerospace testing range on the planet. Its southeastern edge sits around 450 kilometres north-northwest of Adelaide, reached by a single ribbon of asphalt, the Stuart Highway, which runs directly through the restricted zone. Travellers are allowed to drive the highway itself, but by law they are not permitted to stop, wander off the road, or even sketch the landscape around them without written government permission. What lies on either side of that highway is some of the most unforgiving country in Australia. Much of the terrain is gibber plain flat, stony desert, armoured with a shattered pavement of red-brown pebbles, polished smooth by millennia of relentless wind. Elsewhere the land breaks into pale dunes, low mesa hills, and the blinding white crusts of salt lakes like Lake Hart and Lake Torrens' ancient dry lake beds that shimmer like broken glass under summer heat that regularly tops 40 degrees. There is little shade, little water, and even less mercy for anyone who misjudges it. And yet scattered across this wasteland are 27 pastoral stations and 4 active mines, proof that people have always found a way to live here, just never without taking the land's terms seriously. It was exactly this brutal emptiness that made the region so attractive to military planners in 1947. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Britain, badly shaken by Germany's V-1 and V-2 rockets, wanted a long-range weapons program of its own, but had nowhere in its own crowded countryside to test one safely. Australia's vast, sparsely populated interior offered what the United Kingdom could not: thousands of uninterrupted kilometres of open desert and empty sky. The Anglo-Australian Joint Project was born, and the Woomera Range was carved out of the outback almost overnight. Within a decade, it had become one of the busiest rocket ranges on the planet, second only to Cape Canaveral. But the desert the military discovered in 1947 was never empty. It only looked that way to people who didn't know how to read it. The Woomera Prohibited Area overlaps the traditional lands of 6 Aboriginal groups: the Kokatha, Maralinga Tjukurpa, Anangu Pitjantjatjara Yankunitjatjara, Antakarinja Matu Yankunitjatjara, Arabana and Gawler Ranges peoples. For the Kokatha, whose country makes up much of the range around Woomera itself, that connection isn't folklore, it's written into the ground. At a site inside the WPA called Wild Dog Creek, rock engravings carved in the ancient Panoramite-style record kangaroo tracks, human footprints and shelters cut into stone, which heritage researchers date back at least 10,000 years, with Kokatha lawmen describing evidence of occupation stretching 40 to 50,000 years. Kokatha Badu Andrew and Robert Starkey, Senior lawmen responsible for protecting these sites describe their people's presence on this country as older than 11,000 years by conservative written record alone, and far older again by their own oral law. Even now, defence protocol requires that if suspected human remains are found anywhere in the pa, work must stop immediately and police be called quiet acknowledgement of how much of this desert still holds the dead and the memory of its first people. This isn't a landscape of scattered campfire myths. It's governed by Tjukurpa dreaming law, a living system of story, obligation, and knowledge that determines who may travel where, what must be left undisturbed, and how the land itself is to be treated. Around Lake Hart, some of the region's black oak trees are tied to the Seven Sisters dreaming, one of the oldest and most widely shared creation narratives on the continent, its storyline crossing language groups and state borders alike. This is law, carried across thousands of generations, and it carries real consequences for how and whether a person moves through this country. When the range was gazetted in 1947, none of that history was consulted. Kokatha families and pastoralists alike were moved off traditional land with little warning to make way for a rocket program answering to London and Canberra, not to the people who had understood this desert's dangers for tens of thousands of years. It took until 2014 for the federal court to formally recognise Kokatha native title over parts of the Baba official law, finally catching up to a truth that Kokatha had never stopped stating. This was never empty land. It was, and remains, home. The modern history of Woomera reads like a slow accumulation of things that shouldn't have happened. Australian UFO researchers have long pointed to 1954 as the year it began. According to accounts drawn from later released RAF files, radar operators monitoring a test flight over the range tracked an unidentified object shadowing the aircraft one that accelerated away at a speed no test vehicle of that era could match, before vanishing from the screen entirely. No wreckage was ever found. No official explanation was ever released. It became one of hundreds of Cold War-era unknowns that sat quietly in defence archives for decades before the public ever heard of them. Then came the rockets and the failures. Between 1964 and 1970, the European Launcher Development Organisation attempted 10 launches of its Europa rocket from Woomera, chasing an independent path to orbit. Not one of them succeeded. Stages failed to separate. Guidance systems drifted off course. More than once, range safety officers were forced to destroy a rocket mid-flight, scattering wreckage across kilometres of desert that to this day has never been fully searched or cleared. By 1969, the secrecy deepened further. 15 kilometres south of Woomera, Australia and the United States jointly opened the Joint Defence Facility Noongar named, with a grim kind of irony, for an Aboriginal word meaning to listen. Staffed around the clock, its satellite dishes were built to detect the heat signature of a Soviet missile launch anywhere on Earth within seconds, making it so vital to Cold War defence that Soviet military planners are believed to have ranked it among their top 10 nuclear targets. It was also a lightning rod for controversy at home. Many Australians feared that hosting an American early warning post didn't make the country safer, but simply turned it into a bigger target. For 30 years, one of the most tightly guarded listening posts on the planet, operated behind a fence in the Australian scrub, until it closed in 1999, its equipment stripped for scrap, its radar domes left standing empty over the sand. And then, January 2021, the missile. Andrew and Robert Starkey found the 1.3-metre Saab manufactured weapon at Lake Hart West, a registered Aboriginal heritage site that Defence's own records list as off-limits to weapons testing. It lay within 100 metres of ancient structures and rock art. Nobody could explain how it got there. Nobody could say how many years it had been lying in wait. It took 12 months of sustained pressure before the military finally removed it, and by then the Starkeys were already asking a far more unsettling question. If this one was found by accident, how many others never will be? A vanishing radar contact. failed rockets. A listening post literally named Listen. A live missile no one can explain. It's easy to see how the legends took hold. But if you're waiting for the supernatural explanation, keep watching, because what investigators found is even stranger. Subscribe now, we're about to separate rumour from record. It isn't hard to see why Woomera earned its nickname. Take an almost 80-year-old weapons range the size of England. Seal it behind armed checkpoints, staff part of it with foreign military personnel, under a security blanket so tight that even sketching the horizon is a criminal offence, and rumours are almost guaranteed to fill the silence. Over the decades, locals and amateur researchers have claimed everything from a multi-storey underground base hidden beneath the range, to reverse-engineered alien aircraft being tested far from prying eyes, to a theory that the United States quietly shifted its most sensitive Area 51-style research to Australia specifically because Nevada had become too famous. None of it has ever produced a shred of verifiable evidence. No underground facility has ever surfaced in the geological surveys. Mineral exploration data or groundwater studies that have mapped this region in exhaustive detail for resource companies eyeing its billions in untapped ore. No credible technical review of Woomera's radar records or sighting reports has ever pointed to anything beyond conventional, if highly classified aircraft, drones and rockets. And that, historians and defence analysts argue, is really the point. Woomera never needed aliens to be strange. For most of a century, this was one of the most active experimental weapons corridors on the planet. Skylark-sounding rockets, Black Knight research vehicles, the ill-fated Blue Streak missile, even prototype stealth drones like the Anglo-French Tyrannus. Tested here specifically because the range is remote enough and radio quiet enough that almost nothing on Earth interferes with sensitive instruments. The pace has never really slowed in 2024 alone. Defence carried out more than 400 separate trials across the range, from conventional munitions to emerging electromagnetic weapons and autonomous drones. Almost none of it announced publicly in advance. Launch that much experimental hardware over that much empty sky for that many decades, and strange lights, unexplained radar returns, and second-hand sighting reports stop looking like evidence of the extraterrestrial. They start looking like the ordinary residue of a place built, quite deliberately, to keep secrets. The Area 51 comparison, in other words, is accurate, just not for the reason most people assume. It was never alien technology that made Woomera unsettling. It's how much entirely human, entirely earthly danger a government can hide behind a fence for 80 years and still not fully account for. Because the real story of Woomera was never about what might be hiding in the sky. It's about what's still hiding in the ground. By its own admission, the Australian Defence Force has used an area the size of a small country for live fire testing, missile trials and weapons research since 1947, and no agency has ever claimed to hold a complete map of every fragment of unexploded ordnance scattered across it. The 2021 missile at Lake Hart West wasn't an isolated glitch. Kokatha custodians who have spent decades surveying their own country describe regularly finding weapons debris in places the military insists it doesn't operate. As Andrew Starkey has put it, the fact that nobody has yet been killed by any of it isn't down to careful management. It's luck. Layer onto that the region's darker inheritance. To the west, within the same broader network of Cold War test sites, Britain detonated a series of nuclear weapons, 7 major tests at Maralinga alone, plus more at nearby Emu Field between 1953 and 1963, on the traditional lands of the Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara and Maralinga Tjukurpa peoples. Families camped near the test zones were engulfed by radioactive fallout they called puyu. The black mist leaving people blind, sick and in some cases dead, across a landscape a 1985 Royal Commission would later find had been protected by nothing more than ignorance, incompetence, and cynicism. Compensation eventually followed a $13.5 million settlement in 1994, but no amount of money could undo the illness, or bring back the elders who never made it home. Parts of that land remain contaminated today, and will stay that way for hundreds of thousands of years. None of this ever needed a monster or a curse to be frightening. It only needed what was actually there: live weapons unaccounted for, radioactive ground, and a landscape vast enough to swallow the evidence of both. The Kokatha, the Anangu, and every nation who has ever called this desert home never needed a supernatural warning to know this country demanded respect. They already knew exactly how dangerous it could be. Modern history simply proved them right. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in the Gibber Plains and salt pans of South Australia: ancient law and modern science. Arriving from opposite directions, kept landing on the same conclusion: some ground has to be walked carefully, or not at all. Woomera doesn't need extraterrestrials to be one of the strangest, most dangerous places on the continent. It just needed 70-odd years of human ambition, secrecy, and a few thousand square kilometres of desert. What do you think is still out there, waiting in the sand? Tell us in the comments, and if you want more stories where geography, history, and mystery collide, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.